Jonathan Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, I have found this debate absolutely fascinating as we have looked at this issue. And who would have thought on a Wednesday night at 9:25 p.m. that people might find Parliament interesting? But I have found it very interesting, as I have heard different views around facilitation payments and comments around bribery. And I think that the previous speaker, Mahesh Bindra, has brought out a very important point when he talked about those, what did you call them, speed payments. He said that in a number of countries around the world, that's absolutely normal and quite acceptable. And I think, sir, what we are discovering is the fact that we live in a world of great cultural difference. And what might be perceived to be wrong here is not so wrong in other places for lots of reasons. Now, the very first time, perhaps to illustrate this in a benign way, the very first time I went to the United States of America at the age of 17 to play rugby, I went into a restaurant, or a diner actually, and ordered grits. Huge experience, first time I ever had McDonald's in another restaurant. And so in those restaurants where people served you personally, it was expected that you would show appreciation. So not just did you pay for the product, but you showed some appreciation.
Order never had grits, so let's just stay.
Not you, sir. Speaking, that's right. And I have to say that when people talked about tips coming to New Zealand, I was the first to think, no, that's something wrong about that. And we are just discovering that there's cultural differences of understanding around some of these measures. And so when I am in New Plymouth in a restaurant and you get great service, great attitude, you get somebody who is doing their job very, very professionally, very, very well, and you give them a tip, it feels good. They appreciate it. It's not a facilitation payment, but it is something that was culturally difficult to accept a decade or so ago. But today, it's becoming increasingly part of how we show appreciation. And it's got nothing to do with wages. It's got something to do with appreciation of service. And I think that's a generous way to look at it. And so I think that what we understand in this bill is that we have very strong principles here in New Zealand when it comes to public service or people giving a service for what would be the bona fide and acceptable level and means of payment. But in other countries, it's slightly different. And so while we have in this bill something described as facilitation, yet we also have measures in this bill regarding corruption here in New Zealand. We are trying in this bill to live in a big world where we participate. And what we've got to understand is that trade itself is a great facilitating process where people become, can I use this term, civilized toward one another. Because if I have something to sell, I've got to convince you that you want to buy it. If I have got a good or a product, some goods or products that come from this beautiful country, I have to convince people in other countries that this is going to be of benefit. So we have to communicate. We have to perceive that I've got value, you've got value, and together we actually start to dialogue and talk. So trade is a very good means in which we can facilitate increasing harmony and interaction between nations. So while I understand the purist point of view around this debate that has been defended by members on the other side, I also understand the pragmatic view that actually has at the end of it a good result. And what we need to understand is that the democracy that we have come to appreciate, with all of its weights and balances, its accountabilities, its checks and balances, all of these aspects do take sometimes generations to actually become part of the ethos and the cultural thinking of people. So what are we to do? Because we find something in this bill offensive, we withdraw it, say we're not going to participate in that nation. Well, I know companies here in New Zealand who work in some of those nations of the world, and they understand what we're talking about. And if we were to say, no, you ought not have a facilitation payment because that is a bribe and that is corrupt, then what we'll find is that we have lost relationship that can have an ongoing beneficial process of not only enhancing our economic strength and our trade in this country, but also the relationships that we form have some influence upon thinking in other countries. So, sir, in that, I guess, brief analysis, I want to support what this bill says around facilitation payments. And I want to, sir, say that this bill is a good bill. I want to just touch on another area, sir, that the bill speaks on. And this is around the amendment that people trafficking offence applies to activities in New Zealand, not just when victims are moved in or out of this country. Sir, if you would allow me, let me just read from the bill just a couple of sentences. Every person is liable to the penalty stated in subsection 2 who arranges, organises or procures the entry of a person into or the exit of a person out of New Zealand or any other state for the purpose of exploiting or facilitating the exploitation of the person, knowing that the entry or exit of the person involves one or more acts of coercion against the person, one or more acts of deception of the person, or both. And it goes on to say in subclause B that it's not only in and out of the country, but also within New Zealand. Sir, I just want to, at this point in time, put a shout out to a group in New Plymouth who tomorrow evening are organising a public meeting around human trafficking and the abhorrence of it. So the shout out goes to Tūtama Wahine in New Plymouth and also to Steph Lambert, a friend of mine, and in her work as Executive Director of Justice Acts New Zealand. They invited me to be at that seminar and to participate, but I am unable to be there. So I want to wish you the very, very best for tomorrow evening. Sir, just to, if I can talk very briefly in the next 2 minutes about what the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime say about trafficking. Based on data gathered out of 155 countries, and of course, it's so difficult to get data around the subject because it's through such subterfuge that this happens. But according to their most recent report, the most common form of human trafficking is sexual exploitation. 79% of it is that. The victims of sexual exploitation are predominantly women and girls. Surprisingly, in 30% of the countries which provided information on the gender of traffickers, women make up the largest proportion of traffickers. In some parts of the world, women trafficking women is the norm. So insidious is this, that it even affects those of the same gender. The second most common form of human trafficking is forced labour, 18%, although this may be a misrepresentation because forced labour is less frequently detected and reported than trafficking for sexual exploitation. Sir, and this is the shocking figure, worldwide almost 20% of all trafficking victims are children. However, in some parts of Africa and the Mekong region, children are the majority, up to 100% in parts of West Africa. So it is very, very good and very important that this bill places this issue at the heart and centre of it, and I commend this bill to the House.